Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation to speak. What I'm going to talk about is critical reflections on real-time mobility data. I'm kind of coming at this from a critical data studies perspective. So it's kind of a more kind of critical reflexive look around what goes on with, particularly with real-time data that we've been using in our Building City Dashboards projects and trying to create dashboards, and also in just thinking a bit about the COVID-19 crisis and the way in which surveillance technologies are being used and the kinds of data that's being produced in relation to them and how that data is being used and what kind of ethical issues those kind of raise. So if we take things from a kind of critical data studies perspective, then we're typically looking at both sides of the life of data, so the kind of creation and the life cycle, the production from its generation through to its deletion, and also how we live with data. So how does data make a difference to our everyday lives? How does it affect decision making? How does it affect how we make choices and decisions ourselves, and so on? And from a kind of a critical data studies perspective, our view of data is that it isn't just some kind of raw material that we use in our research or in our government work or in relation to business, but that it's a kind of a cooked, manufactured material rather than simply being something raw. So this is something that's generated. It's not something that's collected. These are not benign pieces of information. They're not neutral measures that just simply reflect the world as it is within technical constraints. Rather, they're produced, they're generated, and how they're produced and handled and used is a result of all kinds of choices and decisions. It's shaped by intended outcomes, theories and concepts, by research designs, by procedures, by protocols, by standards, resourcing, finance, regulation, law, organizational processes, ethical reviews, political context, and so on. So all of those kinds of things is kind of an assemblage of different kind of practices and processes and a kind of framing devices shape what data we produce. They shape what we can do with that data, and it shapes what impact that data has on our everyday world. So it kind of acknowledges that data and data-driven technologies are used to produce particular kinds of outcomes. They're used to try and do particular kinds of work. And what that means is that data-driven endeavors are not simply technical systems, they're socio-technical systems. They involve politics, they involve ethics, they involve economic, social, cultural, governmentality factors, and so on. And what I'm going to do is kind of illustrate that through these two kind of case studies. One is around the use of real-time transport data for producing official statistics. And I'm going to particularly focus on more kind of technical aspects, so kind of data access, data quality issues. And in the second part, I'm going to deal more with the spread of COVID-19 and civil liberty issues. So if we think about real-time data and official statistics, there's a whole series of different smart city technologies that can produce real-time data from kind of governmental systems into security and emergency services, so centralized control rooms, predictive policing, coordinated emergency response, and so on, into transport, so intelligent transport systems, integrated ticketing, smart travel cards, bike share, real-time passenger information. I know in relation to some of the project work going on there that you've been able to use mobile phone data and so on. It could be energy data, so smart grid, smart meters, environment with various kinds of sensors producing information, building management systems, and so on. So a rich set of new technologies now that produce kind of big data streams that we can use in our research, but also in our government work and our business transaction work and so on. And all of that kind of data seems to offer potential opportunities for the creation of new official statistics. So national statistics institutions have got very interested in real-time data as a potential way to either supplement or replace the traditional ways in which they generate data for creating official statistics. And there's been quite a lot of effort put in at various different levels, from the national level up to things like the European Union level, up to the global level and organizations like the United Nations and so on, are looking at how can we use some of this data for official statistics. And so we've done kind of some work on this, looking at kind of opportunities, challenges, and risks, and then also assessing particular data sets to see whether they could be used. So on the opportunity side, there's a notion in which you can produce much more timely outputs. In theory, you can produce real-time statistical data. You can kind of compensate for things like survey fatigue, because this data is being generated in any case as a kind of a background process of other kinds of work. That you can kind of improve quality, truthing. You can refine statistical compositions. You can do easier cross-jurisdictional comparisons because the technology is the same in different places. You can optimize workflows and so on. And we can kind of alter what our staff and work are doing and so on. Now, also, there's a whole series of different challenges to this. So there's issues around forming strategic alliances with big data producers, about gaining access into the data, and access is a huge issue here. This is data that has a commercial value and gives a competitive advantage to companies. They're very reluctant to give it up to government. There's big issues around getting access into the methodology and transparency around the methodology to know whether you can trust what's going on and so on, and understand exactly what it is, the data you've got. There's all kinds of issues around provenance and lineage, lots of stuff around legal and regulatory issues and so on. And then there's risks to the organization in particular in terms of damage to reputation, losing public trust if any of this goes wrong. Also, there's issues around trust in relation to people wanting their big data to be used in official statistics. Like when we use Twitter or automatic number plate recognition cameras, we understand them to be used for their particular jobs, as social media and organizing traffic. We don't expect that data to be repurposed into official statistics and so on. So you can lose public trust around this. And this has been a blockage, for example, for things like mobile phone data being used in official statistics. Issues around continuity of access and so on. So there's a whole range of different challenges. But nonetheless, what we've been doing is working with the Irish National Statistics Agency, the Central Statistics Office, to look at real-time mobility data to see whether some of these could be used in official statistics or not. So on the left-hand side, you can see our kind of data sources. So the kind of public transport GPS locations, what goes on at the bus stops, so real-time passenger information. It's travel time along segments of road. It's inductive loop counters, so counting the number of cars that go across the kind of the tar loops in the road. There's things like the number of car parking spaces, the flight locations, arrivals, departures from flights, where all the boats are in the harbour, and so on. Bike share, so how many bikes are moving about the city, how many stands are available in the bikes, and CCTV of roadway footage. And then we've been assessing it across different criteria. So looking at the access, looking at how easy it is to use to gain access into this data, how reliable that access is. Like, does it go down? Is it consistent? And so on. Looking at the granularity. So both the spatial granularity. So what kind of level of detail have we got on the spatial? What kind of level of detail do we have on the temporal? So is this every minute? Is it every second? Is it every 5 minutes? And so on. And whether it's archived, and then also what it kind of represents, and so on. And then we've been looking at this across a range of different kinds of factors. So looking at things like sustainability of the source. So do we think that this organization is going to be there in a few years' time? Are we still going to be getting the same data? Is it reliable? Is there transparency and interpretability in terms of what we're getting? So do we actually really understand the data and so on? Are there any issues with privacy? So does it involve any personal information and so on? Issues around fidelity. So how kind of accurate and precise is the data? How clean is it? How complete is it? How coherent is it? Is there metadata that we can go and have a look at? Can we get a methodological transparency on all the procedures and so on? Is the data standardized? How relevant is it to dealing with the problem that we need to deal with? And we've been kind of assessing those kinds of things, and then trying to think through how those might get translated into maybe KPIs that we want to know in the here and now for like dashboard work, and then into kind of high level stats where we can do more kind of comparison, compare and contrast and comparison across the system. So we've been trying to have a look and then work with the Central Statistics Office to have a think about some of these things, and then to try and place that into the context of this kind of wider socio-technical system and the various different stakeholders that are involved and the negotiations that have to happen, the pieces of legislation and regulation that would need to happen, the issues of oversight and redress, the issues of processing and managing these kinds of data, the issues of reporting, of sharing, all kinds of different things. So we're kind of trying to think of this in the round and understand this data as not just simply collected and then being translated into a KPI or stat and then moving on, but actually understanding the whole kind of realm in which this kind of information is collected to understand that kind of process, to understand whether we can kind of the levels of trust we can put in this, the level of utility, the extent to which we think that these can be meaningfully integrated into the workflow and the system around developing official statistics. Okay, so that's that kind of area. And then the second area I just want to have a look at briefly is in relation to the COVID crisis and the use of surveillance technologies to kind of tackle and track the spread of COVID. So there's a range of different technologies that are now kind of being enrolled into the process of tracking location and movement with the aim of limiting the spread of the virus. So there's a range of kind of smartphone apps. There's a kind of facial recognition and thermal cameras, biometrical wearables, so kind of wristbands to track movement, but also can look at vital signs and so on. Smart helmets that have kind of thermal cameras built into them, drones that might monitor what's going on within certain spaces, and also can be have cameras attached and so on. And then kind of predictive analytics that might take some of this kind of data and then try and look at things like flow and movement and the vectors along which things might travel. And of course, these can be used for a variety of different interventions. So typically might be contact tracing, so to find out how people have been in contact with each other. Could be quarantine enforcement to make sure people actually stay at home and don't leave. Could be travel permission, so you might be able to leave home, but you have to get permission to do that, and then you might have to follow certain routes, and you might use QR codes, for example, and you have to scan your phone, which has been done in Russia. It's also been done in China. Could be social distancing, movement monitoring, making sure people are actually maintaining the distance between each other and how they're moving around a city or a place. Or it could be symptom tracking and actually looking at where do we think hotspots of developing symptoms are and where that might be, and that kind of information might kind of flow into modeling kinds of things. Now, all of that, as you can imagine, raises a whole series of ethical questions concerning the deployment of these technologies. And there's been a kind of a bit of an active debate around whether we're prepared to sacrifice civil liberties for the greater good of public health, and by deploying these kind of technologies, which can be quite invasive around personal information around location and movement, or do we think that we can have civil liberties and public health, and there can be a combination of the two? So, are these mutually exclusive, or can we kind of keep them in contact with each other? And I've kind of written about this in this paper called Civil Liberties or Public Health, or Civil Liberties and Public Health, which is at the bottom of the slide there. And this is kind of the key, I guess, table from that paper, which kind of looks at the kind of technical, practical issues, civil liberties, citizenship issues, and then issues around surveillance capitalism, and framing that in an ethics frame is basically the ethics of how the tech works, the ethics of what the tech does, and the ethics of what the tech facilitates. And so this kind of critical data studies perspective kind of focuses in on this kind of work and asks kind of critical questions around what is actually going on, what trade-offs are happening, and is the tech actually doing what it's meant to do? Okay, so on the technical, practical side, there are actually real questions around contact tracing, for example, the extent to which smartphone apps actually work. There's a lot of evidence now to show that they've had very little input actually into public health. I think the Australian app has been downloaded 6 million times. So far, only one person has been traced through that contact tracing app system. So there's a question around fit for purpose. There's issues around data coverage and resolution, around representativeness, data quality. There's some issues around duping and spoofing, so using it in a dubious manner. There's issues around whether it actually works without critical conditions. So one of the critical conditions of contact tracing is that you have to have 60% of people with a smartphone participating. Only about 80% of the population has a smartphone. There's about 80% of smartphone users have to have the app for it to basically work. So there's kind of a whole series of technical issues. There's issues around whether Bluetooth has sufficient resolution. So if you're going to do with a 2 meter contact resolution, is that enough? Is there enough sensitivity within Bluetooth to capture that kind of nearness and so on? Yesterday, the Irish government announced that their app has about a 62% accuracy and has about 13% false positives. And are we prepared to live with that kind of lack of accuracy in the data? So civil liberties and citizenship. So there's issues here around kind of individual rights versus the public good. There's issues around privacy. There's issues around governmentality. So while privacy has been a big part of the debate online and social media, for me, the bigger issues around governmentality and around citizenship. So, how is this actually changing how governments are, how society is being kind of managed and governed? Because it's actually shaping our behavior about who can go where, how they can get there, who they can meet, and so on. So there's kind of social and spatial sorting going on. There's redlining going on. There's population profiling going on. There's issues around control creep. So technology is designed for one thing, starting to be used for another. A smartphone was not designed to be used as a surveillance device, a public health surveillance device, and then it itself can creep. So we now have a public health surveillance app that could become a security surveillance app, or it could be a policing surveillance app, or it could be, so the technology being developed for this app can then be reused for something else. And it's kind of normalizing this kind of high level, fine grained surveillance of society. And then there's issues around due process and oversight, issues around state record and data surveillance. So, issues around Snowden, WikiLeaks, Cambridge Analytica, and so on. It's kind of undermined our trust in in government's use of data, and that itself has a kind of a chilling effect on public health. And then there's this kind of ethics of what it facilitates. So we've had a pushback on surveillance capitalism, but this is actually legitimating surveillance capitalism. It's basically saying, this fine-grained monitoring that companies are doing is actually useful because we can use it for public health. And so it legitimates that surveillance capitalism. It legitimates the kind of monetization of the data. It deepens the data shadows on us. It potentially acts as a gateway into public health and state data and so on. And it potentially COVID washes the activities of some of these companies. Okay, so there's kind of ethics and procedural regulatory issues on this, and there's kind of moral philosophy issues, and it works at kind of both levels. So I'm kind of interested. A lot of the debate around this tech has been on the procedural level. It's been around issues of privacy, data protection, and so on, rather than on a more normative level of what should be. And so I think some of this debate needs to move towards this normative line of what should be or what versus what has to be. So this is kind of about principles and vision and ethos versus meeting obligations. And, are we, are there realistic attempts to address this, or is the debate around ethics and tech and data really on the left-hand side of this table, where it locates problems in individuals and technical systems, and it talks about things like ethics and bias and consumer rights and fairness, accountability and transparency, which is all good things that we all should be interested in and want? Or is it, are we really more interested in things like structural power, the distribution reconfiguration of society that tries to address these issues in a different way? So, talking about the issues of justice or oppression or citizenship or equity and so on they're related to ethics and bias and consumer rights. And obviously we think that things like consumer rights are important, but maybe citizenship is more important because it's based upon rights as opposed to an ability to pay. And so there's a different kind of thing of seeing these things as procedural versus normative. And actually in the COVID situation, we've kind of come back on these in a procedural way. So rather than kind of asking these questions of, do we really want this kind of surveillance infrastructure? Do we really think it's going to serve public health? It's been around how can we frame the delivery of these in ways that comply with established procedures, as opposed to more normative questions around what kind of society. So, a bunch of different organizations have kind of effectively applied things like the GDPR onto this. So, that it must be transparent, that it must be an expiration date, it would be privacy by design, it should be opt-in, it should be necessary and have purpose, it should have a privacy impact assessment, and so on and so forth. And you can read those yourself. So just the last slide to conclude then. There are many aspects of life and life of data and living with real-time mobility data that require critical examination. So I've tried to do this a little bit on the technical side and a little bit more on the kind of ethics normative side. Hopefully I've kind of got across the idea that for me, these data are products of socio-technical assemblages. They're very diverse consequences for everyday life. We do need a more normative approach onto this rather than just procedural. We need to be very clear about the strengths and the weaknesses, both procedurally and normatively, and to communicate this with all stakeholders. And we really do need to strive to kind of gain what benefits from the data that we can, while also minimizing any pernicious effects and framing them in a normative way that we feel serve society to the best interest, without disadvantaging or discriminating against certain people, and kind of reproducing various forms of structural kinds of injustices and so on. So I'll just end there. Thanks very much.
So, hello, Rob. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine, thanks.
Great, Rob, to be together with us. Unfortunately, not physically here this time, but I have some questions for you that we got from the audience. So if I may, I would start straight away. So the first question is, how do you see the challenges of longitudinality aspects of the big data for providing official statistics across time, given that data sources from private sector may come and go? How to overcome this for providing statistics?
Yeah, so this is a really big challenge for national statistics organizations, and it's one of their key things that they look at is that they want some level of consistency in the data. They know that the data has got to last long term, so they don't want to break in the series. They don't want the data source to disappear completely, and so on. So that's a big challenge for them because they're not in charge of the process. They're not in charge of doing their own surveys or being able to get the administrative data from government. This is coming from the private sector, and there's potential limits there. So that's a big challenge. And generally, what they're trying to do is identify sources that they think will have longevity. And typically what they're trying to do is run them alongside their current processes. And so they're not discontinuing what they already do. So they'll keep that time series going. They're really trying to use this as a complement to see how they might marry up. But it is a big challenge. Like, if you're going to use Twitter data or something, say like on health statistics, which I know like the Netherlands Statistical Society has looked at, for example, there's no guarantee that Twitter will be around in 5 years. Like there's loads of social media channels that have disappeared, have kind of bitten the dust,
Mm-hmm. If I may elaborate.
Also, there's no guarantee that the methodology will stay the same.
Yeah.
So it can change its interface, it can change what data it collects, and so on. So there's no guarantee that the method will be continuous. So that's another challenge.
Okay, very good. So next question is, what is your ideal set of tools and how to use them if you had a free reign?
My ideal set of tools.
Yeah, so in order to produce official statistics from any sorts of big data, I think that's the meaning here.
This is tricky because that really depends on which data that you're using and whether you're doing things like consumer price index or whether you're doing, transport stuff or whether you're doing, tourism stats. Or it kind of depends on the stats or health or whatever. And I actually think it's not really it is a tool in a way, but I think the most beneficial tool is changes to Statistics Acts that gives state agencies access into the data on a basis where they have some kind of say over what data is handed over to them in the way that it's done. And there's very few countries that have managed to do that. In fact, the Irish Statistics Act has been changed to be able to compel companies to give them their big data for no cost, but it's not been enacted principally because the Data Protection Commissioner has been blocking access in. Interestingly, some of the companies they approached were fine doing that. They didn't want to voluntarily give the data, but if there was a Statistics Act that compelled them to do it, they were prepared to do it. But they've not actually been able to take the data because the Data Protection Commissioner is blocking, and that seems to be the gap. So the biggest set of tools actually is really legislative, regulatory that would allow access into the data.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to outline on the first question as well. So good that you got here. So unfortunately, last question, because there are many questions for you, but the last one is, does the cost of real-time data collection infrastructures overweight the ecological costs they consume?
Well, again, it's a bit, a little bit of both. Generally speaking, though, that a lot of this data is being produced in any case. Like the infrastructure wasn't set up to produce the data. The data is coming as a result of having the infrastructure there to do something else in any case. And often that is can be around trying to make systems more efficient or more sustainable or more effective or more competitive or productive. So you would hope that by putting in place real-time infrastructures, you're actually making your systems more effective, which would be creating efficiencies in the system. Now, there are going to be costs to that, obviously, but I suspect they're probably relatively minimal. There are downsides, though, of course. So you can optimize traffic, for example. So you can use your traffic system to optimize traffic, which is about getting more cars onto the road and using that road space more efficiently. Whereas in reality, the solution to congestion is to get people off of roads and get them, so it's a kind of a surface plaster level solution as opposed to a deep structural solution, which is public transport, walking, cycling, less people on the road, as opposed to using big data to get more cars on the road, but optimize what's there. So that's not a very sustainable way of using big data in some ways,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do agree. So I think not using the data might be having a bigger cost, maybe in my mind. But thank you very much, Rob. This was a very good presentation, and it's a very good introduction to the next session B, where we are talking about official statistics as well. So thanks again, and so hopefully see you next time in Estonia.